Welcome. In the next 20 minutes or so, we will explore what it means to understand adolescence beyond the stereotypes that so often shape how adults respond to young people. This presentation is designed for counselors in training and draws together developmental, neurological, relational, and cultural scholarship. My hope is that you come away seeing adolescence more accurately and more compassionately. Throughout, we will work from a strengths-based stance, treating difference as variation rather than deficit, and keeping the dignity of every young person at the center. Let us begin with why this matters. Popular narratives tend to reduce young people to a cluster of problems to be managed, and as a result, adolescents are frequently misunderstood. The purpose of this presentation is to synthesize theoretical and empirical scholarship so that we, as counselors and educators, can see adolescents as whole people. We will move through 4 movements. First, we will dismantle common myths and ground adolescent behavior in brain science. Second, we will examine why engagement is difficult and why the relationship comes first. Third, we will consider neurodivergent youth and youth with disabilities. And finally, we will situate adolescence within culture, where its very meaning is made. Our first task is to confront the myths. More than a century ago, G. Stanley Hall described adolescence as a time of inevitable storm and stress. Decades later, Arnett reconsidered that claim and found that while adolescents do show modest elevations in risk behavior, mood disruption, and conflict with parents, storm and stress are neither universal nor inevitable. Yet the dramatic version of the story persists in our media and even our research. These stereotypes are not harmless. When adults endorse negative beliefs about adolescence, they help create self-fulfilling prophecies, because young people may internalize those expectations and act in accordance with them. Consider one widespread myth, that adolescents do not care what adults think and are simply too emotional to be reasoned with. The evidence points in a different direction. In cultural contexts where adolescents are stereotyped less negatively, young people actually exhibit more positive behavior. This invites a practice reframe. Adolescents care deeply about their relationships with adults and remain genuinely responsive to adults who care about them. Approaching a young person with curiosity rather than suspicion is not merely a kind posture. It is the posture supported by the evidence. To understand adolescent behavior, we turn to the brain. Contemporary neuroscience describes the differential maturation of 2 interacting systems. The socio-emotional system, rooted in limbic and subcortical regions, becomes highly reactive to reward, novelty, and social cues early in adolescence. The cognitive control system, centered in the prefrontal cortex, matures more gradually across the 2nd and 3rd decades of life. This temporal gap helps explain the sensation-seeking that peaks in middle adolescence. But we must move beyond a story of deficiency. Crone and Dahl reframed adolescence as a period of heightened neuroplasticity. The same neural features that create vulnerability also create a remarkable capacity for learning and adaptation. Adolescent behavior is shaped by context and relationship, not fixed by immature wiring, and that distinction preserves real room for growth. This brain story has an emotional dimension. Dopamine receptor density in the striatum peaks early in adolescence, making rewards feel more rewarding and novel experiences more compelling than in childhood or adulthood. The amygdala grows more responsive to emotional and social cues, while prefrontal regulation is still consolidating. Importantly, this intensity is not inherently maladaptive. As Galvin observed, this same reward reactivity can be redirected toward positive, health-promoting behaviors, thereby supporting learning and motivation. The adolescent brain is also highly sensitive to stress. And here is the encouraging implication for our work. When a counselor offers warmth, predictability, and authentic engagement, the adolescent brain is primed to register and learn from it. Alongside the brain, adolescence is defined by the work of identity. Erickson named the central task as identity versus role confusion. The exploration of possibilities across appearance, vocation, relationships, values, and worldview. Marcia operationalized this through 4 identity statuses: diffusion, foreclosure, moratorium, and achievement. For adolescents who hold marginalized identities, this task is layered, encompassing ethnic racial identity, disability identity, and gender and sexual identity, all alongside the broader question of who one is becoming. Closely tied to identity is the tension between autonomy and dependency, which self-determination theory helps us understand as a need for volitional self-governance rather than a need for separation. That distinction deserves emphasis, because autonomy is culturally shaped. As Chirkov and colleagues observed, adolescents in collectivist contexts can authentically endorse interdependent values and experience genuine well-being through them, so long as those values are internalized rather than simply imposed. This guards against a common counseling error, mistaking culturally grounded family interdependence for unhealthy enmeshment. The relevant question is not whether an adolescent is becoming independent in an individualistic sense. The question is whether the young person is developing a sense of agency that is congruent with their values and cultural world. With this developmental picture in mind, we can understand why adolescents so often resist adult-led talk therapy. Young people are frequently referred to by adults rather than choosing counseling themselves, and they arrive wary of yet another authority figure. The developmental drive toward autonomy places therapy in direct tension with the need to feel self-determining, which contributes to resistance, withdrawal, and early dropout. Alliance ruptures are common, and dropout most often occurs early in treatment. I want to reframe resistance for you. A monosyllabic answer or a disengaged posture may signal a fragile sense of agency, a test of trust, or simply a format that does not fit. It is communication, not defiance or pathology. Across the research, a strong therapeutic alliance is consistently associated with engagement, retention, and positive outcomes. If resistance is relational, so is its resolution. Borden described the working alliance as a bond, agreement on goals, and agreement on tasks, and with adolescents, the bond must come first. Therapist behaviors such as fostering autonomy, rolling with resistance, and seeking to understand the young person's subjective experience are what move adolescents from disengagement toward participation. In practice, this means leading with the bond rather than the agenda, treating resistance as a meaningful signal, offering genuine choice, using creative modalities such as person-centered expressive arts, and repairing ruptures openly rather than pushing through them. Humanistic and person-centered approaches fit adolescent development especially well because Rogers' conditions of empathy, unconditional positive regard, and congruence speak directly to the adolescent's needs for autonomy, relatedness, and felt safety. We now turn to our second movement, neurodiversity in adolescence. The neurodiversity paradigm holds that variation in neurological functioning is a natural and valuable form of human diversity, rather than a collection of disorders to be corrected. For adolescents, whose central tasks include forming an identity and finding a sense of belonging, neurodivergence shapes their experiences in profound ways that adults frequently misread. As we move through the next several slides, notice how often distress arises not from the young person, but from an environment that was not built for them. Consider autism in adolescence. This period intensifies social demands at exactly the moment when peer acceptance feels most urgent. Autistic adolescents experience higher rates of co-occurring anxiety and depression, bound up with the pressures of fitting in. Neurodiversity affirming scholarship makes an important shift here, emphasizing that much of the distress autistic youth experience arises from unaccommodating environments, rather than from autism itself. One common response is masking, or social camouflaging, the effort to hide autistic traits to avoid stigma and bullying. It can buy short-term acceptance, but it carries a real and documented cost to mental health. That cost becomes clearer when we consider sensory experience and depletion. Ordinary settings, such as crowded hallways, fluorescent lighting, and noisy cafeterias can exceed an autistic adolescent's capacity to filter sensory input, producing overwhelm that may lead to meltdown or shutdown. Stimming behaviors, such as rocking or repetitive hand movements, serve an adaptive regulatory function. They are not willful misbehavior. Over time, the cumulative effort of navigating social demands, camouflaging, and sensory environments can lead to autistic burnout, a state of pervasive exhaustion, loss of function, and reduced tolerance for stimulation. Recognizing these as legitimate responses, rather than as laziness or avoidance, is essential. A more affirming account of autistic cognition comes from the theory of monotropism, developed by the autistic researchers Murray, Lesser, and Lawson. Monotropism proposes that autistic minds channel attention strongly toward a small number of interests at any given time. When those interests are supported, this produces deep expertise, immersive flow states, and genuine fulfillment. The same attentional architecture also explains difficulty shifting tasks and sensitivity to unexpected interruptions. Reframing so-called restricted interests as legitimate sources of motivation and joy is a hallmark of neurodiversity-affirming practice. Relatedly, the double empathy problem reminds us that social misunderstanding runs in both directions, between autistic and non-autistic people, rather than being a one-sided deficit. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder offers a second example. Although ADHD is popularly associated with inattention and hyperactivity, emotional dysregulation is increasingly recognized as a core feature. Adolescents with ADHD often experience heightened emotional reactivity, intense mood shifts, and difficulty returning to baseline after an emotional trigger. Working memory and executive functioning support emotion regulation, and ADHD symptoms independently predict dysregulation. Many young people also experience rejection sensitivity, in which perceived or actual criticism triggers an intense and painful emotional response. When we understand these features as neurologically grounded, rather than as manipulation or oversensitivity, we can respond with validation and skill building that protect the young person's sense of worth. Our third movement concerns disability in adolescence, beginning with medical trauma. Pediatric medical traumatic stress refers to the psychological and physiological responses to pain, injury, serious illness, medical procedures, and frightening treatment experiences. These responses, including re-experiencing, avoidance, and hyperarousal, vary in intensity and can disrupt functioning, treatment adherence, and recovery. One finding deserves particular attention. The subjective experience of threat predicts traumatic stress more strongly than objective markers of medical severity. In other words, how an event felt to the young person matters as much as how clinically serious it was. Many disabilities are not visible to others. Chronic illness, chronic pain, mental health conditions, learning disabilities, and sensory differences often lack outward markers. As a result, adolescents face skepticism, with their needs questioned and their legitimacy doubted. Fear of stigma leads many to conceal their disabilities, which in turn reduces the accommodations and support they receive. School can compound this. Students with disabilities, particularly those with behavioral or cognitive differences, often encounter lowered expectations, social exclusion, and bullying. For an adolescent whose social standing already feels precarious, the perceived cost of disclosure can be high enough that they choose to struggle in silence. Beyond individual attitudes, ableism is built into systems. Hehir defined ableism as the devaluation of disability that treats it as preferable for students to do things in the manner of their non-disabled peers. When schools organize learning around a narrow conception of the normal student, the burden of adaptation falls on disabled young people rather than on the system. Ableist assumptions show up in inflexible expectations about time, productivity, and behavior, and in deficit-oriented language that defines students by what they cannot do. Universal design for learning offers a structural alternative, building multiple means of engagement, representation, and expression into instruction from the outset. so that a wider range of minds and bodies can participate. Our final movement situates everything within culture. Adolescence is not a fixed biological fact. It is a cultural phenomenon that shapes when the period begins and ends, what it means, and what is expected of young people. The Western image of adolescence as a time of rebellion and individuation is far from universal. Many societies mark the transition through rites of passage that emphasize communal belonging and increased responsibility, rather than separation. As Greenfield and colleagues demonstrated, development follows different cultural pathways, with some cultures orienting toward independence and others toward interdependence as the endpoint of healthy growth. This brings the contrast between collectivist and individualist expectations into focus. Self-determination theory clarifies that autonomy and interdependence are not incompatible. Adolescents thrive when they authentically internalize their cultural values, whether those values emphasize independence or connection. The clinical implication is direct. Counselors must avoid imposing an individualist template of healthy development onto young people whose cultural worlds define maturity differently. A young person deeply embedded in family obligations may be flourishing rather than enmeshed. Race profoundly shapes how adolescence is perceived. A well-documented example is the adultification of Black youth, in which adults perceive Black children as older, less innocent, and more adult-like than their white peers. Epstein, Blake, and Gonzalez found that adults viewed Black girls as needing less nurturing, protection, and comforting, with the most pronounced differences in the 10 to 14-year age range. Goff and colleagues documented parallel misperceptions for Black boys, linked to harsher treatment. The consequences are tangible, contributing to disproportionate school discipline and reduced access to the developmentally appropriate support that any child deserves. Identifying adultification helps us see a Black adolescent as the young person they are. Indigenous worldviews offer a fundamentally relational understanding of the person. Where mainstream models center the bounded, individuated self, many indigenous epistemologies understand identity and well-being as constituted through relationship with family, community, ancestors, future generations, land, and the spiritual world. The Circle of Courage, grounded in indigenous child-rearing philosophy, frames healthy youth development around belonging, mastery, independence, and generosity, integrating autonomy with deep relational and communal commitment. For Indigenous adolescents, cultural and spiritual connection functions as a powerful protective factor, and supporting that connection can be among the most meaningful interventions a counselor offers. Adolescents and immigrant families navigate development across two cultural worlds, because young people typically acculturate more rapidly than their parents. An acculturation gap can emerge in values, language, and expectations. The acculturation gap distress model proposes that these differences can produce family conflict and adolescent distress, though strong and warm family relationships can buffer those effects. We should also recognize bicultural competence as a genuine strength. Many immigrant adolescents move fluidly between cultural contexts, and family obligation often carries deep meaning rather than functioning as a constraint. Our task is to understand interdependence as a potential source of strength, while remaining attentive to real intergenerational strain. Let us gather the implications for practice. First, accuracy itself is an intervention. Counselors who hold strengths-based beliefs create the conditions in which young people flourish because stereotypes are self-fulfilling. Second, relationship precedes technique. The therapeutic bond is not a precondition for the real work. It is the active ingredient, especially for young people referred against their will. Third, behavior is communication. The autistic adolescent in meltdown, the teen with ADHD reacting to rejection, and the disengaged client are all telling us about their needs and their environments. Fourth, culture is not an add-on. The meaning of autonomy, family, and maturity varies across cultural worlds. And fifth, environments are targets of change. A neurodiversity-affirming, anti-ableist stance shifts the burden of adaptation away from young people and toward the systems that serve them. To conclude, Understanding adolescence beyond stereotypes requires holding several truths at once. Adolescents are neurologically primed for emotion, reward, and learning. They are working to become themselves while remaining connected to others. And they are doing so within bodies, minds, and cultures that vary enormously. When adults meet adolescents with developmental humility, cultural respect, and relational warmth, they create the very conditions in which young people are built to grow. So as you move into your work, I invite you to replace suspicion with curiosity, deficit with difference, and control with relationship. Thank you for your attention and for the care you will bring to the young people you serve.